Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one we see several developments in favor of the Russians across the eastern and southern section of the front line. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to advance here in the direction of Bohoyavlenka. The Russians have launched an operation to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the southern outskirts of the defensive lines of the Ukrainians by Bohoyavlenka. The Ukrainians have two layers. They're the ones situated in the eastern parts and just south of the settlement, and then a second layer ahead of it. The Russians are now storming the first layer of defenses along the forest lines, and this geolocated footage confirms this advance. Further north in the direction of Katerinivka, the Russians have advanced in the northern and southern parts of Katerinivka, reaching the central parts of the settlement, having half of it now under their control and cutting off the connection between Antonivka and Katerinivka for the Ukrainians. This is confirmed with this geolocated footage here. The Russians are here doing some heavy fighting against the Ukrainians, where the objective is to gain control over Katerinivka and then move into Antonivka, both from the southern and eastern sides, in a combined assault. Further north, in the northern direction of Konstantinivka, the Russians have captured the first line of defense of the Ukrainians here. As mentioned in previous videos, now that the Russians have secured Maximilianivka and the highway between Marinka and Kurakhove, the defensive positions of the Ukrainians along the north of Konstantinivka, situated between the two settlements, are now in a vulnerable position, and the Russians will likely continue with such operations to secure their positions along Konstantinivka and Marinka, to launch further offensive operations both in the direction of Antonivka and the fortified positions, ahead of fighting reaching Kurakhove itself. Moving further north, geolocated footage confirms the Russian capture of Soriane. The fighting here is very difficult for the Russians, because if we take a closer look at Soriane, zooming in and taking a look at the elevation and geography, we can see that the settlement of Kurakhove is an uphill battle for the Russians. They have to go uphill, and the Ukrainian positions in the buildings are all overlooking the settlement of Soriane. So although the Russians have managed here to capture the settlement and will now be able to fight over Kurakhove, they are located in the low ground towards both Hirnik and Kurakhove, with a few hills here and there. So in general, it is difficult for the Russians to advance further from this direction, but securing this eastern flank will allow the Russians to gain control over the Ukrainian settlements to the south, and from there do a combined strike from multiple directions. Also, the high ground is not very significant for the Ukrainians, considering the firepower advantage of the Russians and the newly rotated units, which are fresh units, which, in contrary to the Ukrainians, who have been fighting for a long time, are much more exhausted. Although the Ukrainians have a geographical advantage, that is not 100% of the fighting. Moving further north, we see that the Russians have advanced further in the direction of Selydove, where they have advanced first, gaining a foothold within the settlement and capturing the industrial area, and now moving into the residential area, similar to when they first entered Selydove, but now this is with the cover of both flanks being under Russian control and the fire control over the only supply route in and out of Selydove. This means that the Russians have gained a significant advantage now compared to last time. Moving on further north in the direction of Torske, the Russians have advanced in the northern parts to capture another forest line and do some positional fighting in the northern direction. The Ukrainians have counterattacked in the south, recapturing the farm area in the eastern outskirts of the settlements, confirming my assessment that this battle would be very difficult for the Russians, considering the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians in this direction and the limits to the Russian offensive capabilities. The Russians are here securing the northern flank and widening the front line, while the Ukrainians have kicked out the foothold the Russians have gained in the eastern outskirts. The heavy fighting continues in the Torske direction, where the battle is still undecided. Further north in the direction of Terny, the Russians have captured a few fields, securing this area here to flatten out the front line and connect the northern and southern spearhead. The objective of the Russians is to gain control of the road between the Russian positions and Terny in the northern direction as well as in the southern direction. Moving further north here in the direction of the settlement of Vishneve, the Russians have captured the majority of it, with only the northwestern outskirts of the settlement remaining under Ukrainian control. With this, we see heavy fighting continues in the settlements across the Selydove river line, where the Russians have crossed over from Andrivka. We have some reports of the Russians moving in the direction of Kurakhove as well, but it's unlikely there will be a serious offensive towards that before they have fully secured Vishneve and likely also the surrounding areas. In the direction of Kurakhove, the Russians have managed to capture the Dacha area in the northern parts by the Oskil River, cutting off any connection between Koslinikivka and Kurakhove. The Russians will continue offensive operations in both the northern and southern directions as they continue fighting over the Oskil River line. In the northern direction, I missed an update from a couple days back where the Russians have expanded their zone of control in the forest area west of Sinkivka. The Russians will look to gain control over the Oskil River line, the eastern bank of it, all the way down south towards Kupiansk, where heavy fighting is now continuing over the forest patch. And that is it for the frontline changes since my last update. Returning down south to the direction of Bohoyavlenka, we see that the Russians are now launching further offensive operations along the forest lines towards the Ukrainian fortified positions. We see that the Russians have started out with the fortified positions in the southern direction, separating the first and second lines of defense. The objective of the Russians is to secure the roads directly up towards Bohoyavlenka, and they're doing so from the weak point of these fortified positions from the side of them. They're achieving success by looking at the defensive positions from a different perspective, and that is looking down here. And if we take a look at it, we can see that in comparison, the Russians only have to look at the side of it, which significantly weakens the effectiveness of these fortified positions. Naturally, there's this one here, but the Russians can again flank their positions, attacking from the rear, then turning around to then advance further along the forest lines to gain control over these fortified positions from the rear. So what we are seeing is that the Russians continue offensive operations at the weak point of these fortified positions and then advance alongside them. Gaining control over these will allow two roads towards Bohoyavlenka, both the eastern and western ones. This will allow the Russians to then push on to the next fortified positions of the Ukrainians. The eastern ones are much more difficult to fight over. As we can see, these are circular ones that cover every single direction, therefore there is no weak point to it. But again, as the saying goes, defending everywhere defends nothing, and that means that the forces in these areas are split to cover multiple directions. So if the Russians go around them and then attack from one singular direction, then it would be weaker than a single direction defense, but it has no weakness of flanking attacks. So in any case, there are different solutions for different problems that appear on the front line. With the Russian assaults here in the direction of Katerinivka, the Russians now control the eastern parts and have reached the central parts of the settlement. There are a few schools and other buildings in the center that are better fortified than the remaining parts of the settlement. Gaining control over the center will allow the Russians to create a foothold for offensive operations towards Antonivka and the western parts of Katerinivka. Taking a look at the river line in the western parts and the fortified positions near Ilinka, there is a separation between Antonivka and Katerinivka in the east and those two settlements in the west, where their next settlements is more difficult for the Russians to fight over than the ones they are already fighting over by Antonivka and Katerinivka. However, gaining control over these two settlements will allow the Russians to flank the next line of fortified positions, where again the Russians are flanking from the side, where the defensive positions are weakest, and similarly in the north they can do the same. Further north here in the direction of Soryane, with control over the fortified positions and the settlement itself, the Russians now have full control over the eastern parts between Krasnoyarivka and Karlivka and several settlements along the Vovcha River line, almost full control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha River line. This means that the Russians can concentrate their forces both here in the direction of Selydove by Karlivka, directly connected with Donetsk city through Pisky, Pervomaysk and Karlivka, and they can concentrate their forces in the larger arc by Avdiivka through Ocheretina towards Novohrodivka, and in the southern parts by Krasnoyarivka. All of these three different areas allow for three different offensive operations. Directly from Donetsk, it will be the offensive operation near Selydove. From Avdiivka through Ocheretina towards Novohrodivka will be towards Pokrovsk, and from Krasnoyarivka it will be towards Kurakhove. So we see that there are three main supply hubs for three different offensive operations, and this is exactly why these three settlements were extremely important for the Russian offensive operations in this direction. By securing the next settlements of Kurakhove, Selydove, and the general area around Novohrodivka, the Russians can then launch further offensive operations towards Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and the western direction towards Andreevka and other settlements along the next defensive line of the Ukrainians. So you see that the next fortified positions that the Ukrainians have along the front line are continuously important logistical hubs for further offensive Russian operations across the southern section of the front line. And all of these positions are very vulnerable and near the front line, which limits its effectiveness for Ukrainian operations. And this makes it a decisive moment for the battle of the southern parts of the Donetsk region, which is separated by Pokrovsk in the south and Kostenivka-Sloviansk Kramatorsk line here in the east, which is the northern part of the Donetsk region. Both of these are two separate battles. In the direction of Torsk, we see with the recent developments that the battle continues. The Ukrainians are attempting to recapture, which they have managed to prevent a Russian foothold, and the Russians are attempting further north, and we see heavy fighting in that direction. Someone pointed out a very important detail, and that is the more modern drones do not have a range of simply 5 kilometers, 5,000 meters, but instead some of them may even reach 15 kilometers, which will allow the Russians to use drones in the direction of Torsk, maybe not completely from Kreminna, but from the forest areas nearby, will allow the Russians to use these drones within Torsk and the general area. It will also mean that the general situation is that if the Russians gain control over Tursk and Sarishne, they will be able to cover Liman with these drones, and the Ukrainians can operate from Liman to cover the front line near Tursk. What this means is that the fighting here near Tursk is much more difficult than first expected, but it also means that the Russians have the proper reconnaissance to provide heavy fire support such as FAB bombs and similar to cover with these regular mass-produced drones to cover the Ukrainian forces present within the settlements. This means it will be difficult for Ukraine to continue operations within the settlement, and they may be forced to abandon it if the heavy Russian fire continues. And this also means that the general area here east of the Serbis River line is heavily covered by Russian FPV drones. It is only the older models from the start of the war that have a coverage of about 5 kilometers. The vast majority now covers about 15 kilometers. This also changes the situation here in the north, the Russians now being able to launch FPV drones from Kurakhove with the updated range of 15 kilometers. Entirety of Selydove is covered, and the drones may reach the southern outskirts of Kupiansk from Kurakhove. If the Russians advance further along it, we can see from Lushkivka they will be able to cover the southern parts of the main parts of Kupiansk, and from Sinkivka the Russians will be able to cover the entirety of Kupiansk and even the rear positions of the Ukrainians in the area. So we see in general the Russian FPV drones near the front line have extensive coverage, but there's also a limit to how many troops they can send who are FPV operators to the frontline positions when they do not have a lot of these settlements under their control. So it will not be an even battle between the Russians and the Ukrainians until the Russians control the eastern bank of the Oskil River line. And that is exactly why the Russians continued these heavy operations over the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, because capturing the eastern bank of it will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions in that section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.